So for me, anti-Black racism, specifically in Toronto, is the dismissal of the Canadian Black experience. When I say that, I'm really talking about the naming of it. A lot of times when I hear people talk about anti-Black racism, I hear them talk about or reference the U.S., that Canada, Toronto, we are not the U.S. You know, U.S. has a history of enslavement, colonization, and that doesn't happen here in Toronto. What happened to George Floyd was sad. Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, but does that happen here? And I think even having that discussion with other Torontonians, it's hard because they don't see the relevance to Toronto. And then I have to remind people constantly that it does happen here. What about Regis Trimkonsky Paquette? What about Devontae Miller? It does happen here. So I would say anti-Black racism really happens in the erasure or the dismissal. And for Black people, it is tiring. It is within our structures. So for example, growing up here, in education, when I'm talking about education representation, so seeing teachers in the front of the classroom not looking like you, the curriculum not reflecting what I've grown up, cultural values, and that is throughout the educational system. So elementary school, high school, undergrad, and even graduate. As I got a little older, university, yes, there was some representation, but still it was very minimal. And for a Black person, striving to kind of figure out where you're going to be, what career aspirations you should have, you're always looking around you. And when you look around you and you don't see representation, what does that say? That is anti-Black racism. We started having this conversation. This conversation has happened in the past. And how do we acknowledge the pain, the suffering, and the sacrifices of the people of the past, the advocates? A lot of Black Canadian scholars like Professor Jo Ki-wan that talks about moving from the me to the we. Professor George Day. There are many people that talk about this work, and we need to acknowledge that this is something that is happening here in Toronto, and we experience this all the time. Even growing up through the educational system was the fact that one of my teachers only had me for 1 year, didn't really take the opportunity to get to know me, and just had issues with me. She wasn't in support of schooling, academics, and sports at the time, and she made that very clear. For me to be allowed to leave like 5 minutes early from a class, my coach would actually have to come and get me, and that affected how I took in the content of the class because I knew that I felt like she had something personal against me. This was confirmed after I graduated with honors. I went back to visit one of my teachers, and she saw me in the hallway, and she pulled me aside and she said, "Oh, Melanie, I didn't realize that you were on honor roll. Good for you." Like it was like something, the most impossible thing that a Black female could do, and even describing that experience to others. If you were a Black person, this was a normal experience. But sometimes describing it to other non-Black students or non-Black colleagues, it would be like, "Oh, well, are you sure? Were you disruptive in class?" I always would have to justify myself, and that can be very tiring, and that plays into anti-Black racism.